Hello, and thank you for joining us for our conversation about expressive and receptive language. Before we begin the presentation, I just wanted to direct your attention to the QR code that we have on your screen. That should work all around the world, hopefully, and we also have provided a shortened URL. We're not sure if that's going to work for all of our international friends, but hopefully it will. If not, we will provide a way for you to access the presentation at our Q&A later in the conference.
My name's Elaine Bernstorf, and I teach at Wichita State University in Wichita, Kansas, right in the middle of the United States. I've been to several ISME conferences before, and I really enjoy the interactions.
And my name is Mara Culp. I'm an assistant professor of music teaching and learning at the Eastman School of Music, and this is my second ISME. And so before we jump in, we just wanted to have a little overview of the objectives that we're going to be considering with you today. And so we're going to be talking about some definitions, some labels versus our observed functions or behaviors. And you can see we have some sub-questions to guide our conversation as well. We're going to talk about receptive language in music education. And then we're also going to be talking about expressive language in music education. And as you can see from the visual on your screen, we're going to be having a conversation about this sending and receiving loop and how they interact and affect one another.
One of the things that we wanted to bring out is this idea of definitions versus functional ideas. When we're working in the area of special education and music therapy, sometimes we get kind of caught up in the definitions that are on IEPs or that foster eligibility. And one of the things that we wanted to think about is what are the typical behaviors that we see in the areas of expressive and receptive language. Some of those behaviors may actually include non-participation. They may be things that are behavior differences of what is different than what we expect from normal children or children who do not have developmental differences. So some of the things we're going to talk about are posture, eye gaze, breathing patterns, and gesture, and how all of these things function as expressive language. And that when children are receiving information, we want to be paying attention to all of their behaviors and everything that they are doing, not just looking for correct answers. One of the things that ISME always does in this commission is to talk about label-free, and label-free is key. So watching for the behaviors rather than using a label to determine what we're going to see. So in the next slide, we talk about receptive language in music education. And is receptive language different than listening or perception? The American Speech and Hearing Association says that receptive language is the ability to understand both nonverbal and verbal language. And this includes understanding the meaning of words, concepts, questions, and figurative language. ASHA doesn't actually have a definition for the word listening, but Merriam-Webster says listening is paying attention to sound. And ASHA doesn't actually describe perception, but Merriam-Webster says awareness of the elements of the environment through physical sensations. And so what we would say is that the common denominator across all of this is sound and participating with sound, because in music, sound is the language. So what are the behaviors we want to look for? Sometimes students are unoccupied, and we can't always tell that they're receiving, but we should always assume that they are. Watching for when they begin to attend, then looking for when they begin to receive what we have to offer. Then when they start to respond, sometimes those responses are positive, sometimes they're negative, but they're still responses. And then also looking at imitations and constructs and how students take what we offer and either give us exact repetitions or make it their own. And then finally, how they answer us when they're answering questions for us. So when we think about structuring for better reception, one of the things that we are finding, especially in the area of speech and language, is that discrete trials training, where we just teach people how to say and do certain things through exact repetition, does not necessarily foster functional language. And so what's really important is that we give the whole context. In other words, that we play a whole song, or that we do an entire activity first so that context is set. then we can extract or focus down to some examples that we want to work on to actually provide vocabulary or to help students experience concepts. And then finally, we reinforce that by looping between our own modeling and then going to guided practice where we are actually co-constructing songs and language with children, and then leading them to more independent practice. So these are really important concepts as we think about it. And Mara's going to talk to us about supporting receptive language.
Yes, and thank you for providing that wonderful foundation on which to build here. So we're just going to give you a few strategies for you to think about as you consider how can I support receptive language growth in my setting. And so one of the first things to consider is really allowing and encouraging listening as thinking in my head, and also providing appropriate wait time for your learners. Different students are going to need more or less, and so make sure that you give them that time. Modeling those inner hearing behaviors for your students, modeling think alouds, and using repetition, and also thinking about the difference between exact repetition versus some variations, and allowing some of that to flow naturally. And the good and the bad of stream of consciousness teacher talk over those music inputs. And again, going back to this idea of modeling inner hearing, modeling good listening behaviors, where you're allowing the students to see you really attending to the music and how they should be doing that, also in the setting that you have provided for them. Then along those same lines, we want to be thinking about active listening behaviors and cultural norms that are going to be existing. Thinking about school as a culture, and also home cultures, social identities, and the ways in which the students move through various spaces. So what does receptive language usually look like in my students' cultures? And do I seek unrealistic receptive language habits in school culture? Elaine and I have had many conversations about the necessity or the utility of always asking for eye contact, single raised hands, and only giving correct answers or opinions in a space. And what does that foster in our students? And are those reasonable behaviors all the time, every day, in every context? And then also, how can I model being receptive and still demonstrate classroom management? So again, how can I be open to my students' expressions, but then also having some level of order in the classroom to my level of comfort, and to also allow for a positive learning environment.
So now we're going to shift, go ahead.
And so when we think about expressive language and music education, shifting, as Elaine was saying, shifting gears here, we're going to talk about, is expressive language about elicitation or is it about accuracy? So again, going back to that culture that you are providing for your students, and how do I handle these wrong expressions? What do I do there? And then do I really foster spontaneous speaking, singing, or nonverbal expressions, or am I really trying to elicit very narrow expressions in my space?
So one of the things we want to talk about for a minute is, what are we going to see students doing in terms of expressive language acquisition? And there are actually two types of major descriptors for language acquisition that speech pathologists use. One is this idea of gestalt. In other words, that students will elicit language, they will copy what we say. And so many times these are imitations of words or phrases that are unanalyzed. And this is normal behavior in young children, but once they get to a certain age, we shouldn't be always having students just echo what we say. They should begin to generate their own ideas. And this is when that is called analytic acquisition of language. So in analytic acquisition of language, they may actually produce less language. They may only use one word, but they will use it more functionally, and they will express it using prosody, using inflection. They might use two words, especially when students get to using two words, they will have more meaning. So they may say the word cookie, and if they say cookie with a question mark sound, we know they're asking a question. If they dropped it and they say cookie, then this one word may actually be more important and generate more functional expressive language than a child who can imitate or sing back an entire song accurately, but to not understand and not have the meaning behind it. One of the things that we wanted to mention is that it's important for us to allow students to generate inappropriate or wrong answers when they're generating them analytically, and that sometimes that actually shows us what they are learning more than to just be able to do rote imitation. Sometimes we foster rote imitation in the way that we teach songs, and that doesn't necessarily help them to learn to generate expressive language.
And so when we think about supporting expressive language, you'll probably see a little bit of overlap between some things for receptive and also as for expressive. But as we said in the beginning, and I showed that image, that it's this cycle that kind of, feeds each other. And we also just want to remind you that this presentation is available. So I'm just going to go through this somewhat quickly, looking at kind of the main bullets, allowing and encouraging those nonverbal and verbal responses, encouraging some imitative responses, but not always, as we've said, providing choices for nonverbal and verbal responses, providing vocabulary to use rather than expecting vocabulary recall, modeling those think aloud behaviors combined with the nonverbal and verbal responses, repetition, again, exact versus the variations that you can provide, and then also the good and the bad stream of consciousness teacher talk over music inputs. And so again, hopefully you can see some overlap there and how the behaviors actually interact with one another. So thinking about all of these concepts, how can we kind of put this into context and kind of a way of thinking for music educators, for all of us really? And so we have 4 stages to support expressive language, and you can see them labeled here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the first being gaining attention. So this is how you elicit the response from your learners and start the turn-taking behaviors that really is underpinning a conversation, my turn, then your turn, and then responding to the turn-taking. So modeling those behaviors for the students and modifying your delivery, simplifying your language, and varying those types of interactions, how those are taking place. After that, if you've gained the attention, building the vocabulary, using active and meaningful activities. We have instruments here as an example. Students are often very motivated by instruments, so using those contexts can be great for them. You can support this by using pictures, gestures, and signs to illustrate the song or a task. So showing images of the xylophone, showing images of the maracas, as well as having the students play them too. After you have built the vocabulary with the students, fostering that spontaneous language in step 3. So using that active involvement with synchrony, with joint attention. So again, going back to instruments, a great place for this, where we're all playing the xylophone together, we're playing the same song, we're focused on the same task together. You can model this language with exchanges that support interverbal cueing, a word or a phrase that evokes a particular response. So thinking about some of those behaviors that you can do in your space where the students can have a predictable response that's also meaningful, but again, spontaneous in that kind of a way. So the last piece of this then, after going through those 3 steps, is generalizing. So basically, this is where you move from a routine to a novel context to elicit spontaneous and flexible language. So something the students are used to doing, and then something that's new to them. So if you've been doing instruments or a certain kind of instrument, maybe playing a new kind of instrument or doing a new kind of activity where the students can generate something else. And in this way, you want to offer a decision-making tasks, so the students have some ownership there. So again, you're not just telling them what you're going to do, they're going to have some ownership there. So those would be the 4 stages and steps that we would recommend to support expressive language.
Another aspect of this expressive language elicitation is thinking about the cultural impacts. So what is normal for the culture of the students, whether that is a ethnic culture, whether it is a community style, but we also have a tendency in music to have our own musical culture. And one of the things that can happen is that sometimes we have a little bit of a bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, to perfection as musicians. And so sometimes we sort of don't want to have students answer unless we know they're going to answer give the right answer, especially if they are students who are difficult for us to understand. If a paraprofessional is not in the room and we don't understand what a child says all the time, and then we may not call on that child as often, and those are the kinds of things that can slow down their expressive language growth. So one of the things is thinking about relevance and also providing long-term functional growth. One of the things, again, I would say is to be careful that we don't always just want rote imitation answers out of our students who do not express themselves well, because while that makes us feel good and it makes us feel like they're growing, it isn't always the case. So sometimes we need to think about different ways to gain their expression. Some of those may be nonverbal. So just having them sing is not always the best goal. Having them to spontaneously respond is really what we're looking for as we want them to grow expressively. One of the easy ways to help us think about that is a little cycle, and I've actually picked this up from a conference, a professional development conference online, with people who are working with AAC, in other words, alternative communication devices. And we're talking about shared reading and helping students to begin to use their devices, and that is their expressive language. And so one of the things they suggested is a little cycle called AIR. The idea behind it is that AIR is attention, gaining their attention, using relatable materials, things that they enjoy, a lot of pictures perhaps, setting up their communication board so that it is exactly what they will use in the future, and then masking those areas that they might not use. Then inviting the student participation. Again, sometimes we don't necessarily invite our students that are difficult to understand to respond to us. And then finally, responding and redirecting their interactions. And so sometimes I think that we want an easy way to remember things, and this is a nice little cycle to help us. We've gotten a lot of good information across here. You can see this little girl doing the shared reading. One other comment I would make is that we need to provide far point and near point ways for students to respond. In other words, we're using a lot of smart boards and things like that are far point, but it's really important for us to have materials for students to point to and to touch and to interact with, so that they can express themselves in close proximity and not have everything be on the wall somewhere, especially for our students with disabilities. I think Mara's going to summarize some final thoughts for us as we're winding down here.
So thinking about how we supported reception, for example, today in our presentation. So we purposely chose to use the video and the audio so that you could see our faces and you could interact with us in that kind of a way. Also, our use of pictures to support the concepts. We had the text on the slides. We were also reading aloud at times, and we have provided you the PDF so that you could follow along or even go back and look at. And we should also mention that because this is a video, theoretically, a student could rewind, slow down, etc. And that's another way that you can increase a student's ability to understand and receive information. So for opportunities to support expression, we hope that you can join us for a Q&A session on Friday, July 31st.
And so in conclusion, we have our cute little pictures here of some children who are both receiving and expressing themselves. It's really important that we think about our own practices and beliefs. What are we doing in the classroom that fosters receptive language? What are the things that we are doing that fosters expressive language? Knowing that language is also verbal language, but also musical language. And what are the kinds of things that we want to do that foster both expression at school and at home and within social settings. And as we go through time, the usage of expressive language of all kinds, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, is extremely important for us. So let's reflect, finally. Do we always try to elicit something expressive from our students? Or are we allowing them sometimes to just be receivers? Sometimes it is appropriate for them to just be listening. Is it okay for students to express themselves all the time, even if what they're expressing is not accurate? We have a tendency sometimes to shut down things that we see as inaccurate responses, and yet that is a learning experience for the students. Another thing is for us to think about our diversity and how do we have multiple ways for students to respond. Universal design is very, very helpful in thinking of all these things. And finally, thinking about our own receptive and expressive skills. How do we interact with our peers? How do we interact with paraprofessionals? How do we interact with other students? All of these are things that we are using to model both receptive and expressive language to the students that we are working on or working with. So finally, we are basically done for today, and we've really appreciated being with you. We have just a few references here. There are many others that we could provide, but these are the ones that we think might be helpful to you. I would comment that there are some wonderful things out there to be had, not just in the world of music, but also get to know your speech pathologist and ask them for information to support your work. Thank you for being with us today.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you for our Q&A.